Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast on Chinese philosophy. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. So Richard, are you, as a professional philosopher, instructor, teacher, and writer, are you worried that AI is going to make you redundant anytime soon?
Yeah, maybe actually a little bit. Actually, they're getting very smart. I don't know if you've been using ChatGPT 4, but I've been using it to write poems for my friend's birthday and do a little research. And I even typed in find some connections between Forrest Gump and Zhuangzi, because I actually have the students watch Forrest Gump. I don't know if you've ever done that, but teach it as a kind of Taoist film. I don't think I came up with that, but I've come to think that.
Yeah, that's a good way of doing it.
Yeah, but I think, but more seriously, I think in some ways, AI will be able to replace us in certain tasks. But I do think, until the robotics gets really sophisticated, where, basically we're in really futuristic kind of scary time where you can't really, robots are out there just looking like us and behaving with, where you can't even see a difference. I think that's a long, long ways away, far, at least until we're long gone. So I think for now, people want to see flesh and blood people and be taught by them and have them make jokes and smile and, move around. And it's for the same reason why you do want to go to a live concert. You want to hear, I heard Aerosmith is doing the last year of touring. I didn't even know he's still going, but I think he's 70. He's still going. But anyways, it's their last year. And, you could just sit home and listen to maybe a higher quality version of the song, right?
Yeah.
But there's something about being there.
Definitely. I prefer live music. That's right. So that's one way that we could, those of us who are worried about somehow, I want to say losing your job, but also losing your sense of purpose and meaning, one way you can preserve it or rescue it is you can say, there's something about the thing that I do to get meaning, my livelihood or whatever, that necessarily requires that an actual human being be the agent of that activity. An example I often go to is when I listen to musical lyrics, somehow it's just much more powerful and compelling for me if I know that it's reporting on, or at least purports to report on, someone's inner life. If it's just a total fabrication, it just wouldn't be as compelling to me. So some sort of essential reference to someone's inner life seems to be ineliminable, and that's one way of rescuing it. I don't know. I guess I was talking with a friend in philosophy about this recently. It seems like if it were to be the case, and I actually don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, but if somehow AI sort of made many of us redundant so that large amounts of sort of human labor, including both blue collar and white collar labor, is somehow performed by machines, suddenly we'd have a really great crisis. And it seems to me that, for people who do certain kinds of research, it could be a problem that AI is able to do their research better than them. But I'm not so sure that, at least for philosophy instructors, I don't know about philosophy researchers, but philosophy instructors, I'm not so sure that people will be satisfied with just knowing that the AI has given them the correct answer to a philosophy problem, whether it's the problem of normativity or the hard problem of consciousness or the really hard problem of meaning or what have you. It seems like there's something about philosophy, in order for it to do whatever it is that we want it to do, and we want it to do lots of things, I think, we've really got to be able to see and understand the arguments for ourselves. And that requires a teacher, that requires someone who can explain it well.
And also philosophy, if you think about it as a practice, you got to engage in it. You got to have conversations. You got to think through the questions yourself and along with others in dialogue. So just reading answers on the screen, that's not the whole of philosophical practice. I think that's why, you do go to APA. It's usually just to hang out with your old friends, but in those conversations while drinking a beer, you talk about philosophy and you're engaging in the activity, right, of philosophy. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, someone could say, well, maybe we'll design AIs that are able to sort of recreate those dialectics, those dialogues, those conversations really, really well, so that it feels almost like a natural kind of philosophical discussion with someone. And yet, I still think that there's something just deeply unsatisfying when you're talking philosophy, in thinking that there's no other, without having sort of assurances that some other conscious being is mirroring your understanding,
Yeah, that they have experiences. And if you found out your wife is a robot, that's going to be pretty sad, right? Even if some sense you had the same experiences, I guess, from your perspective, it turns out that your wife is a zombie, right? Or the philosophical zombie, the one with philosophy of mind type, with no experience, or
Yeah.
where the lights are out.
No inner life. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
no inner life. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right, because we're humans, right? Presumably, right? And we want to interact with other humans with something like the
Yes.
emotions and experiences that we have.
Yeah. That's right. I definitely want to. And I also think that I have good reasons to want to.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So for today's topic, what I think is a very interesting topic, and Justin, I know you came up with this, and yeah, why don't you say a little bit about it?
It's my topic, and maybe it's my kind of hobby horse, or it's just my fulfilling a kind of wistful desire that I've long had. It's also a kind of distinctive approach. So I think the way we're going about today's episode is going to be a little bit different from what people expect, although I hope we'll establish a kind of template that we can use for future episodes. So what's different about the approach is that we're really just doing a deep dive into a particular piece of text in a traditional Chinese philosophical source. So it's kind of one passage that we're looking at closely. So the passage is one that I think a lot of people who have studied some Chinese philosophy will know, but maybe because it's long enough, it's a little too long, they won't have really discussed it in great depth. It's not quite high enough on the list of famous passages in classical Chinese philosophy to have entire papers written about it. And yet, I think it's perfect for sort of a deep dive, whether that's in the classroom or in a podcast. Anyway, so the passage is a conversation. So it's chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi. We've talked about the Zhuangzi before, Zhuangzi, the second of the great Taoist texts, the other one being the Tao Te Ching. Of course, there are a number of chapters. In chapter 4, there is a dialogue between Zhuangzi, otherwise known as Confucius, we can call him Confucius, and the guy who, by legend, according to legend, was his star student, his most talented student from a very poor family, but so gifted and quick and sincere and earnest. And his name is Yan Hui, Yanhui.
His favorite student, right?
Yeah, absolutely. His favorite student died tragically young, and he really mourned his loss grievously. Yeah, so this is a conversation between Confucius and his star student. And it's, kind of a surprise to some people when they first read this, because they're like, what is Confucius doing lecturing people, almost sounding like a Taoist sage in a Taoist text?
I was surprised myself when I first, I'm reading through the Zhuangzi, and all of a sudden, chapter 4, I'm like, oh, there's Confucius. What's he doing there? And I actually really enjoyed it. I don't know. It was quite humorous in some ways, just finding him out of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it took me a while to come up with this analogy, but it's a bit like, the kind of irreverent use that you see of major historical kind of celebrity figures in South Park or something. You'll just see suddenly these major important historical figures.
Or Socrates appearing in Aristophanes, the Cloud,
yes,
I think.
Yes,
yeah,
right,
something like that. He's kind of he pokes fun at him, and it's fun.
And actually, there's sort of a subgenre of Taoist study of what role Confucius is playing in the Zhuangzi. Confucius seems rather wise, but he sometimes admits to certain limitations. So he sometimes admits that there are people who have even sort of greater profundity than him, have a deeper insight into the nature of things, or what have you, deeper sort of enlightenment than he does. So seems like he's sort of a Taoist figure in the Zhuangzi, but not quite a full manifestation of the Taoist sage. And maybe some other time when we have more time, we can discuss that. But this is actually one dialogue among others between Confucius and various people. But this particular one has always interested in me, I think, because it speaks to me in a way that I worry is a little bit too flattering. So it describes, the student Yan Hui basically comes to him with a proposal. He's heard about this really cruel, childlike, tyrannical ruler of a nearby state, the state of Wei, that's Wei. And back then, Confucianism in general was known as this, both a kind of moral worldview that was, but also a political one, had a sort of socio-political vision that Confucians taught, according to which rulers should adopt more humane governance. They should adopt kinder policies, and that they would be more successful in ruling their people if they adopt those policies. So in some ways, it's kind of a stereotype that the Zhuangzi is playing to, but it's sort of understood that Confucius and his students are something like missionaries going out trying to convert rulers to the Confucian way, which will then have great benefits for their people, because their people will be better fed, they'll be better protected, they won't be sort of arbitrarily used for corvée labor, what have you. So they'll be able to farm their own fields and reap greater crops at harvest time. And it's meant to be a really good thing to do. And Yan Hui, having heard that this ruler of the state of Wei is a tyrannical, terrible man-child, proposes that he go there and do that he go there and persuade that ruler to adopt the Confucian way of governing and adopt Confucian virtues and institute humane governance there. And Confucius, to everyone's surprise, both to the original audience, surprise of the original audience, and to our surprise today, actually kind of shoots him down.
Right.
He thinks it's crazy, and it's crazy for some of the obvious reasons. It's just imprudent. He's not going to succeed, he thinks.
So the irony is that Confucius himself, as I had learned about it, would do this, right? He would try to persuade rulers by going around and do exactly what he's telling Yan Hui in this passage not to do. Yeah, which is very interesting.
Yeah, there's an ironic twist there. Yeah.
Or is the idea that this is like the late Confucius? So like maybe there's like, early, middle, late Confucius, and this is like Confucius when he's older and he's like, he's gone through the rodeo and he's like, hey, son, this is not going to work.
Yeah. He's experienced the world now. He knows better. Yeah. Yeah, that's possible. He's kind of world weary. That's an interesting reading of it. So this is Confucius at the end of his life. He's tried several times to get really awful rulers to see the light and failed. And so now he's going to help Yan Hui. Yeah, so I don't know of any standard term for this dialogue, but I call it Yan Hui's conversion mission. And so that's going to be the one that we'll discuss. The entire episode is just a in-depth discussion of that passage, but it's not like it's simply historical, of course. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there. Basically, what ends up happening, give away the ending, is that Confucius talks his student down from a really agenda-driven approach to this task to eventually doing something that more or less means dropping the agenda completely and just going to hang out in the state of Wei without any particular goal or purpose whatsoever. I'm not sure if I've given a sort of accurate description of the recommendation that Confucius ultimately gives by the end of the dialogue. I think that should be left to readers or listeners, their own judgment and interpretation of the passage. But it seems like he's more or less encouraged his student to de-escalate, to kind of cool off until he more or less has no agenda whatsoever. And the interesting upshot of the whole dialogue seems to be that that's really the only way that you can succeed at persuading someone, is essentially not to have any intention to persuade them in the first place.
That's very interesting. And given today's sort of polarized climate, the politics of today and the bitterness and the rancor, it seems like this is going to connect with, many contemporary cultural themes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I think it has pretty profound implications for persuasion as people attempt to conduct it today, especially on what I want to call the kind of hot button issues, the emotionally charged issues, the ones that have a great deal of, they elicit sort of tribal feelings, us versus them, those issues. Or maybe we could even broaden it to say any issue where one puts one's ego sort of on the table. One sees that, whether they win or lose a debate over a particular issue somehow will have stakes for their own self-esteem or what have you. Any issue like that, that's sort of charged, emotionally charged in that way. Those are the ones that I think Taoists are recommending we approach in this very, very delicate, basically indirect, in a way that involves no concerted attempt to persuade people whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. So it's very relevant, I think, for today. And yeah, good. I'm looking forward to discussing this dialogue with you, Justin.
All right. So that's what we'll do in part 2 in just a second.
Great.
Okay, so the dialogue is Yan Hui proposes a conversion mission to his teacher Confucius. Yeah, did you want to give us just a little bit of historical context or background, Richard?
Yeah, sounds good. Again, this is chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi, one of the so-called inner chapters, which I guess scholars do tend to think that is more representative of the writings of the historical Zhuangzi, or at least more faithful to the historical Zhuangzi. I know there's a lot of debate about that. And in fact, one of our friends, Esther Klein, I noticed she has a paper about that, like trying to argue that actually you shouldn't really even think in that way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, she's very skeptical. Richard's referring to someone who's in our classical Chinese reading group, who's a really great sinologist at Australia National University, Esther Klein. She wrote a very influential article casting doubts on the authorship of the Zhuangzi and a lot of the sort of assumptions that people make about the composition of the text, including this one that is you'll find very widely shared, which is that the inner chapters, the first 7 chapters of the Zhuangzi, were authored by Zhuangzi himself. Those are interesting issues. I always thank my lucky stars that in my research, I work primarily on the Chinese philosophers because I don't have to worry so much about authorship. But in any case, I hope it's all right with you listeners and with you, Richard. I mean, I want to kind of note those issues because they're super interesting.
And in fact, I was reading Tao Jiang's book, Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China, and he addresses these issues in a very sophisticated and very interesting way. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk to him at some point.
Yes, we definitely should. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to dismiss those issues entirely, but I think we're going to set them aside and just speak conventionally as if Zhuangzi himself were the author of this passage.
Yes, some people bristle at that, but I guess we are just poor philosophers and we're really interested in these really incredible ideas. But that doesn't mean we don't think the text or the history of it is unimportant. It's definitely important.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We just have an easy way to refer to the author, among other things.
Right. Okay, good. So the stage. Okay, so what goes on here? So we encounter Confucius or Kongzi and his star student, his favorite student, Yan Hui. And at the time the dialogue was written, it was assumed that students of Confucius were on a mission to convert bad rulers to become more humane and virtuous and just. And in fact, that's what in the Analects we find Confucius himself doing. And an actual historical follower of Confucius, Mengzi or Mencius, we find him doing that exact thing actually later.
Yeah.
So it seems like Yan Hui is also going to attempt to help convert this Lord of Wei, who is known to be a bad ruler who behaves like a petulant child, treats his subjects brutally. And so he has this idea that he's going to go and convert him and proposes to do what good students of Confucius are supposed to do, which is convince Lord of Wei to become a better ruler. Now, what's surprising about the dialogue is that Confucius basically disagrees that Yan Hui should go to the Lord of Wei using these tactics that Yan Hui proposes. And he's in a series of exchanges, he shoots down Yan Hui's proposals. In fact, even the more gentle ones like, oh, I'll go there with humility and so on. We'll get into more in-depth discussion about this. But even the more gentle, indirect approaches, surprisingly, Confucius basically just shakes his head and said, no, that's not going to work. And he becomes a kind of weird skeptic. It's very interesting. And eventually, Yan Hui suggests that he should basically go to Lord of Wei without any agenda at all. And Confucius finally agrees. And also, this is where that whole this concept of fasting of the mind comes in, which I was always interested in. And it was intriguing and very mysterious to me. So maybe you'll have more thoughts on that, Justin. So that's kind of how it ends. And Confucius also gives some advice about, how this will all work out. So anyways, that's sort of, I think, the basic structure, the broader picture.
You set the stage very well. Thanks. I wanted to flag that last point. There's a phrase, fasting of the mind, which appears in this dialogue. It's one of arguably just 2 places where the phrase appears. But a lot of scholars think it's a very significant term, that it refers to a particular kind of mental discipline, maybe a kind of meditation or some sort of contemplative discipline or practice. And it's really hard to know because we have so little access to early historical sources. But once we hear it in context, maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. So if it's all right with you guys, what I'll do is I'll kind of break the dialogue down into some parts before we begin discussing it. That way we have some structure that we can use to wrap our minds around what's really a pretty large and kind of meandering dialogue that wanders off in a number of different directions. So I think we can break it down into 4 sections. And each section, I think, can be sort of described in terms of a certain psychological profile that Yan Hui proposes to his teacher. So the first one is the one that where he sort of proposes the mission in the first place. And I would say the psychological profile implicitly in that one is missionary zeal. So he's going to go there. He's going to convert this petulant child ruler or young, he's sort of man-child to the Confucian way. And Confucius shoots that down, as you rightly said. So that's section 1. Section 2, he proposes another psychological profile that I'm tentatively calling non-confrontational integrity. So it's supposed to describe someone who maintains a kind of personal moral integrity. They stick to their principles. They don't capitulate. They don't cave. They don't make compromises with other people's values. They stick to their own values, but they're non-confrontational about it. They're not in your face. They're not constantly preaching, they're not wagging their finger at you or critiquing you in this sort of way that seems really abrasive. So that's another psychological profile that he proposes. Confucius shoots that one down. So that's the end of section 2 of the dialogue. Section 3, he proposes a new one that I will call quiet inner integrity. And this is one where I think we're supposed to read Yan Hui as suggesting that he basically is willing to compromise and comply with the ruler's directives, indulge the ruler's bad side in a number of different ways, so long as he inside, within his own mind, maintains a certain kind of uprightness. He's willing to sort of stick to his guns, stick to his principles. How exactly we describe that sort of distinction between inner and outer requires some careful thought and conceptual work, I think. But I think it's a psychological profile that we all know. I mean, I think these psychological profiles should be familiar to us. And so I'm calling this one quiet inner integrity, and we'll see if maybe we can come up with some contemporary examples that are evocative of that profile. So that's the third one. That's the third section. Of course, Confucius shoots that one down as well. So then we get to the fourth and last section, which I'm just calling no agenda. This is the one where after fasting the mind, he now goes to the state of Wei without any plan or intention really to convert the ruler at all. That's one way of describing it. See if you agree. And so that's the final solution. And Confucius actually agrees with that one. And then he ends with a kind of almost mystical description of what it's like, what it will be like to live in the state of Wei, to interact with the ruler of Wei in his court in this state of mind where he has no agenda whatsoever. So that's the 4 sections. And actually, yeah, Richard, I think it's important enough to have the text before our mind's eyes, so to speak, that it would be worth just kind of reading some parts of the text.
Yeah, sounds good. And so we're going to read a translation from, is this Paul Kjellberg? Yeah,
Paul Kjellberg's translation from Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy. But there are still other many good translations that we could recommend. Brook, Ziporyn's, now Richard Lynn has added his own translation. Of course, Burton Watson has a very readable, almost literary translation.
Yeah, maybe we'll list all those in the podcast notes.
Yeah, I'm happy to assume the role of a student. That's still my favorite role after all this time. I could read the Yan Hui bits if you're willing to read the Confucius bits.
Okay, it's quite a burden, but yeah, I'll read the Confucius.
Yeah, yeah, expectations are high.
Yeah.
All right, so it starts off with Yan Hui just asking Confucius for permission to go on a trip. He hasn't even yet said where.
Okay, so Confucius asks, where are you going?
To Wei.
What will you do there?
I've heard that the Lord of Wei is young and willful. He trifles with his state and does not acknowledge his mistakes. He is so careless with people's lives that the dead fill the state like falling leaves in a swamp. And people have nowhere to turn. I've heard my teachers say, leave the well-governed state and go to the chaotic one. There are plenty of sick people at the doctor's door. I want to use what I have learned to think of a way the state may be saved. Okay, so pause there. So yeah, you get the sense, right, that Yan Hui is trying to prove, at least I think it reads rather naturally as a sort of almost stock dialogue up to this point, where Yan Hui is trying to prove his enthusiasm and his eagerness to implement and practice and carry out the teachings of Confucius. So he's saying, listen, Confucius, I know that you've always encouraged us to go to the chaotic state where the sick people actually are. Don't be a doctor administering to healthy people. Be a doctor that finds the sick people and minister to them. And so that's what I'm proposing to do. Clearly, the Lord of Wei is a bad ruler. And so I could do much more good there. And of course, he's implicitly showing a lot of courage because the Lord of Wei, being young and willful, could be the kind of person who just executes people who offend him or somehow diminish him, make him feel like a less of a person or like a bad person, what have you. So it seems like a courageous act. This seems like precisely the sort of thing that a certain stereotypical Confucius would stand up and applaud and encourage and praise. Yeah. So then there's a really long, maybe we shouldn't actually read. There's a number of paragraphs in English translation where Confucius shoots this idea down. He basically says, you're sure to get hurt. And I think instead of reading it all, maybe we could just boil it down to a couple of points. Here are at least 2 points that I think we can take from Confucius's first answer. One is that if Yan Hui parades around the court of the Lord of Wei, making a display of his sort of high standards, his high moral standards, and his own personal integrity, that's just going to make the ruler look bad. So Confucius just says, obviously, it's going to elicit a negative response from the ruler because he doesn't like looking bad. And in fact, there's a way of reading Confucius's response is basically saying, listen, if you in any way get the ruler's ego involved, he's just going to dig in his heels and he's going to fight back. He's going to be even more resistant to persuasion. So I think maybe the takeaway that we can take from this is just if people's egos become involved, then they dig in their heels and they become more resistant to persuasion. I think that's one of the upshots of this very long first response from Confucius.
And I think that's a really interesting and important point. I mean, that goes on today, right? Even in geopolitics. And
yeah,
I mean, I remember, I think this was some years ago, Anthony Blinken met with the Chinese diplomats. Do you remember this? And then he went, I was blown away. And my wife and I were just shocked by how obtuse he was because he started criticizing the Chinese government at that first meeting. And I was like, what? And then, of course, they, responded in a
they bristled. Yeah,
they bristled. And then, of course, they criticized the U.S. And that was a very bad event. And it was totally unproductive. And I was like, that's not what you do, And I mean, which is weird because you might think, oh, but they're diplomats, so, they're detached. But human beings we have egos and we have pride, and you don't want someone to crap on your country. And
and you're often frustrated because there's certain things that seem obvious to you, and it bothers you that other people sort of deny them. And so you want very much to sort of air the arguments for it or make the case. And even though you kind of know, this is the kind of weird thing about human psychology, oftentimes there's not a chance that you're going to persuade someone, and yet somehow you still want to give your arguments airtime. And I don't know why, just for the expressive value of arguing, I'm not sure. But yeah, exactly. So it's a description of that kind of interaction, which is so familiar. I mean, it's not just high stakes diplomatic stuff. It's like me, I think of myself sort of arguing politics with my family, not my immediate family so much, but just like relatives or friends from back home. And
the uncle at Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. Actually, one of the reasons this dialogue really speaks to me is because as long as I can remember, I've had sort of the, I guess what we'd call the family peacemaker sort of psychological profiles. That's my sort of temperament, has been peacemaker, not just in my family, but in everything, among friends, like in my department. I'm always trying to be the one who makes peace between different factions and such. So that's why I'm really fascinated with this dialogue. I worry that it's just self-congratulatory in some ways because... But anyway, yeah. So I've had to resist over the years that impulse that makes me want to just argue with the cantankerous uncle over Thanksgiving dinner. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is going back to Confucius's response to the initial proposal, which is too long to read. He also says something else, which suggests to me that there's another critique in the works. He basically says that Yan Hui vastly underestimates how difficult the task will be. So it's not just that the ruler is going to have his ego at stake and that he's not going to want to hear criticisms that make him feel like any less of a good person or what have you. It's also that the ruler holds all the cards, right? He has all the power. And he says generally rulers are very good at manipulating people. I mean, when you're not convinced by their arguments, then they're happy to insinuate that some coercive power could be used, or that they could take something really valuable to you away from you. And so they're very good at using both direct and indirect means together in a way to manipulate people into agreeing with them.
Right. Maybe the ruler is even smarter and maybe better at rhetoric and more persuasive, even if he's in the wrong. There are people like that. Just because someone's, wrong doesn't mean they're not persuasive. There's all kinds of people like that.
Yeah. And I have to say, when I read this dialogue, I think by the time you're done reading Confucius's initial response to the missionary zeal version of Yan Hui, I think, oh, of course he's right. It's just obvious that he's right. And yet there was still a part of me when I first read Yan Hui's proposal that admired him. There is that part of me that thinks, oh, this is great. He's a guy who wants to speak truth to power and try to save this subjects of the state of Wei who are dying in great droves, that they're like leaves piling up in the swamp waters. That seems like a really worthy, admirable thing to do. And yet this more Taoist Confucius is absolutely right that it's complete folly. He's never going to succeed.
So Confucius is kind of doing realpolitik here. Isn't that
Yeah.
the term nowadays? Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it. Yeah. Okay. So that's section 1. And thanks for indulging me. I will actually read more text, but it's just, there was so much in section 1 and we just couldn't do justice.
Of course, listeners can go back and read that part, which is actually very fascinating. And he does actually praise Yan Hui in some ways. He says, you have a faithful heart, or he says, right? Like, he says
you have a reputation for being virtuous and
virtue is deep.
Exactly. So, so Confucius does praise him. That's true. It's not, he doesn't just shoot him down. Okay. So Confucius, we're seeing some of the skill of Confucius as a teacher. Good teachers don't just shoot down their students' ideas. That's my
That's right. You've always got to do a compliment sandwich.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what that is, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. The expression. I've always said I couch my criticisms in praise or compliments, but yeah, sandwich is better.
Or is it a criticism sandwich? Wait, I can't. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Is it a criticism or a compliment sandwich? I guess criticism, right? Because you have the criticism in the middle with the 2 buns of compliments up and bottom.
I think that makes more sense. I love that, actually. I had never heard the expression, but I was teaching this Buddhism course many years ago, and I had a TA, a graduate student, who was himself basically an evangelistic Buddhist, as one of my colleagues described him. He was, I didn't know such a thing existed before I met him, but yeah, he really believed in Buddhism. And he was, the way I taught, the course, of course, I'm sort of a softie. So sometimes people would ask a question which basically revealed that they hadn't done the reading, or they would just give a really obtuse interpretation of a doctrine that was just clearly wrong. And because I'm so temperamentally predisposed not to just shoot students down, I always feel like that creates a kind of chilling atmosphere. I would say, well, that's a really interesting idea. And then I'd say, there's this other way of reading the text, and I would sort of suggest that maybe their interpretation wasn't right. Then I would kind of congratulate them at the end, but still so creative and thoughtful. I thought it was a great idea, well worth mentioning. Thank you. And so my TA said it drove him nuts because he said the students would hear, oh, really interesting idea, blah, 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 blah. Congratulations for having such a creative thought. They wouldn't hear the criticism, right? So they wouldn't hear the so-called meat or the center of the sandwich. They would only hear the bread.
Okay. Huh.
Interesting. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, that's a worry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes I run out of time, and instead of doing a criticism sandwich, I think I do an open face version. So I just go with a compliment and criticism.
Oh yeah. Open face sandwich. Yeah. Right. That's more efficient. Yeah. And there's less danger of obscuring the criticism. Good. Well, let's start on section 2, which is this new psychological profile that Yan Hui proposes that I'm calling, and feel free to disagree with me if you want, non-confrontational integrity. And so here is Yan Hui. He says, suppose I am upright but dispassionate. All right. Upright but dispassionate. Energetic but not divisive. Would that work? So that's what I'm calling non-confrontational integrity, being upright but dispassionate, energetic but not divisive. I'm thinking of, maybe this isn't quite right, but I have friends, I really admire these people, by the way. I have like a friend who, when she flies out, sometimes she comes out to visit us, my spouse and me, and she's so environmentally aware of her impact and sort of conscientious as a consumer of resources, natural resources, that sort of thing, that she just, as a matter of course, whenever she flies somewhere, donates a certain amount of money to preservation of forests or what have you, so as to, counteract the damage that her flight has done. And she's just very quietly adopted a vegetarian diet, and just in so many ways is a kind of good steward, a good citizen of the world. And yet she's not at all in your face about it. She never really tries to push you, never really tries to convert you. And so that's the kind of person I'm thinking of as the person that Yan Hui is proposing to be. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but
those are some of my favorite people. Yeah.
Exactly.
I like those people a lot.
Yeah. And I think, right, I do too. It's like, it's hard not to admire those people. And one of the things that's always going on in these old Taoist texts is that it's critiquing implicitly, or maybe sometimes not so implicitly, other schools of thought. And here I have to say, certainly the Confucians are the ones that are targeted here. So in Analects 1434, I think it is, there's this famous line about how you should respond. Confucius actually makes kind of an argument in this passage that you should respond to hatred or injury, kind of, mistreatment by others with uprightness. Mm-hmm. So not with revenge, he says, not with kindness. That's also the wrong response, but uprightness. So you're picturing someone who, in the face of harsh treatment, still manages to maintain their kind of integrity. That could be the kind of person that Yan Hui is describing here. That's Yan Hui's proposal. And then Confucius has a response.
All right. So he says, no, how could that work? You'd use all your energy to sustain the performance, and your face would be unsettled. Other people can't stand that, so they have to resist what you suggest in order to ease their own minds. If gradual virtue wouldn't work, how much less such a great show of force? He'll dig in his heels and resist change. Though he may seem well disposed on the outside, on the inside, he'll never consider it. How could that work?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot of interesting suggestions there. I think the gist of it is just that he's going to be astute enough to recognize that you are nevertheless comparing yourself, that you, Yan Hui, are nevertheless comparing yourself favorably to him. That is, comparing him unfavorably to you, that you're implicitly criticizing him. So he'll dig in his heels and resist change. Though he may seem well disposed on the outside, on the inside, he'll never consider it. And then Confucius also suggests that another problem with this approach is that it's false. It's not sincere. He says you'd use all your energy to sustain the performance and your face would be unsettled, right? So it's like people will be able to tell that you're not entirely on board, that like as the ruler, I don't know, makes sport of killing people or what have you. Of course, your face is going to reveal that you're disgusted by it or you find it abhorrent in various ways. And so he's going to feel criticized. So in a way, even though he's trying not to be divisive, he doesn't like outwardly show this great zeal, it's going to still be manifested because he still disagrees with the ruler and he wants the ruler to change. So there's no way that the ruler won't know that, because why else is he there at all? So there's still a goal there, and that's going to be revealed to the ruler. And that's enough to have the ruler, I guess, dig in his heels and resist change. Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah, one of the running themes of this dialogue, I think, is that one of the assumptions is that we are deeply ego-driven intersubjective beings, which is to say that we spend enormous amounts of time and enormous amounts of sort of mental resources figuring out what other people really think about us, and we're so good at it that, of course, it's going to be very hard to hide. So, your face would be unsettled, Yan Hui. Like, he'd still be able to tell that you're disgusted with or you find abhorrent his behavior and would feel criticized for that reason. And so he's already going to be resistant to change for that reason. Yeah, so that's section 2. In section 3, Yan Hui proposes a new psychological profile. The idea is that he's sort of de-escalating, right? Like that he's supposed to be less and less confrontational. And so I was looking for the words to describe this new psychological profile, and I came up with quiet inner integrity. This is a harder one to distinguish, I think, from the second one, from non-confrontational integrity. But it is very clear that something's supposed to be going on internally that allows Yan Hui to preserve his integrity. But externally, he's going to be relatively, in fact, maybe completely compliant and sort of willing to go along with the ruler's, I don't know, preferences or way of life or what have you. So this is Yan Hui describing what I call quiet inner integrity. Then how about being inwardly straight and outwardly bending? Having integrity, but conforming to my superiors. Being inwardly straight, I could follow heaven. As a follower of heaven, I would know that even the Son of Heaven and I are both children of heaven. If I speak only for myself, why worry about the approval or disapproval of other people? I could be what people call childlike, which is what I mean by being a follower of heaven. So he's just described what's the sort of what we call the inwardly straight side of the equation. Now he's going to move to describe the outwardly bending part. He says, by being outwardly bending, I could follow other people. I could lift the ceremonial tablets, kneel, bend, bow. This is all the etiquette of a minister. So he's saying he's going to adopt the conventions, the ritual conventions of a minister. Others do it, so why shouldn't I? As long as I do what other people do, who can complain? This is what I mean by following people. So then he concludes, having integrity and conforming to superiors, one follows olden times. My words, whether they are in fact instructions or even criticisms, belong to antiquity. They are not my own. This way one can be straightforward without causing injury. This is what I mean by following olden times. Would that work? This last paragraph that I read actually about following olden times or having his words or criticisms belong to antiquity, this is a little bit of unexpected twist, I think, for some contemporary readers. But for readers who read this dialogue in historical context, it wouldn't be that surprising. So what he's describing is a strategy that Confucians and just generally people of the court who were well educated and erudite often adopted, which was to, in an attempt to sort of take the ego out of a criticism, basically say, well, this isn't my view. I'm just invoking tradition,
Mm-hmm. You're citing scripture.
Yeah, citing scripture, citing historical records that record a kind of golden age during which time people really flourished and states prospered. So it's a way of sort of unloading responsibility and thus any claim to credit in making your criticisms. You can say, oh, I'm not necessarily saying I'm any superior to you. Maybe I would be the same kind of ruler as you, right? But I am saying that in ancient times, especially in these golden age periods when government and society were close to the ideal or ideal, this is how they did it. And so then I think the idea is that, the ruler is going to be less threatened because you're both comparing yourselves to this sort of really lofty ideal that everyone understands is very hard to reach. It's no longer like, oh, look at me, look how superior I am. It's look at the ancients and see how great they were. It's a nice little addition offered by Yan Hui, who is now, you might say, more attuned to this worry about ego and about people digging in their heels when their ego is at stake. Mm-hmm. So he kind of made this new proposal, quiet inner integrity with what we might call classical sources or invoking classical authorities.
And also acting outwardly, like in conformity with the routines, the rituals, the norms and conventions of that time, or of the ruler.
Exactly right. That's clearly critical. Yeah. He's saying I'm going to be quite compliant.
I mean, one thought I had while reading this was, but aren't you like behaving in bad faith? Or like, I would have thought integrity means like wholeness. So you're like, there's something weird going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my view as someone who works on the later Chinese tradition is that this issue that you're picking up on, Richard, which has to do with like whether you're really being sincere, whether you're authentically reporting and reflecting your actual views of the matter. That's a kind of theme that I tend to call wholeheartedness, which I think is very powerfully implicit, almost explicit in the classical tradition in a lot of texts. And then later they started explicitly theorizing insofar as they talked about this Chinese term cheng, which kind of became a technical term, sometimes translated as sincerity. In some contexts, it just means wholeheartedness. And the idea is, there's for all kinds of very important purposes that have to do with persuading others, being a member of society in good standing, being trustworthy, and for purposes of just being a virtuous person, you need to go about your life in a sort of wholehearted way where you're not, behaving in ways that in any way you're reluctant to endorse or act on. So it's not like there are parts of you that are reluctant or grudging. You're just behaving entirely, you might say psychologically speaking, you're all on board with every word that you utter, with every move that you make.
Is that different from the unity in thought and action, for example, in Wang Yangming? That's
yeah, exactly. So I think, it's a nice reference. So in the later tradition that I work on, there's this famous Neo-Confucian philosopher, Wang Yangming, famous doctrine called unity of knowledge and action. And it seems like that is one way of articulating one of the criteria that you have to meet in order to have the kind of wholeheartedness that I've been describing. It's sort of his own conception of wholeheartedness requires that your action is in some way unified, in some pretty deep ways unified with what you know. Anyway, so I think that in the Zhuangzi, in this passage, he's making reference to this idea that you still wouldn't be fully sincere if you're adopting this psychological persona, the quiet inner integrity one. Because outwardly compliant, sure, but are you really sincere in being outwardly compliant? Seems like you're kind of play acting, right? And that seems problematic too. So Yeah. Anyway, so Confucius critiques that one.
Right. Okay. So here's Confucius. No. How could that work? You have too many policies. You are planning without reconnaissance. Even if you succeeded in avoiding blame, it would stop there. How could you hope to change him? You're still making the mind your teacher.
Yeah, exactly. So now we really see Zhuangzi, or the Taoist Confucius, take a turn toward Taoism, understood as the philosophical worldview that recommends acting on unself-conscious instincts, inclinations, natural predispositions, and that kind of thing. So he's saying you're still making the mind your teacher. You have all this planning. You have all these policies. And just imagine going into a really high stakes, difficult situation where you need to persuade a ruler who's very powerful and manipulative of an entirely different way of governing, an entirely different way of living. How could you possibly expect that through a series of complex policies you're going to pull that off? He recommends that you just abandon any attempt to work it all out through sort of deliberate policies and planning. All of that falls out of the general heading of making the mind your teacher.
Wait, so does planning without reconnaissance, so that word reconnaissance, it refers to something like the knowledge of like the setup, or like?
I think his idea is, that's right. I mean, it's a good question. So I'm not sure, but it seems like the suggestion is, at least if we're going to translate it the way that Kjellberg has, that Yan Hui doesn't actually know that much about the Lord of Wei. He knows that he's a sort of a man-child, but, he doesn't know what his particular weaknesses are, what his foibles are. He just doesn't know. And yet he still thinks he can devise some general policies and plans as to how he's going to interact.
So he's jumping the gun, is that idea here.
Yeah, that's right. So in general, Taoism, especially kind of classical Taoism of the Zhuangzi, and for that matter, the other Taoist texts, the Tao Te Ching, it's often associated with this view that human beings in general are better at handling unexpected things if they just rely on something like, let's for now call it natural instinct, rather than rules or procedures or some kind of, pre-approved template. Pre-approved templates are always going to fail to do justice to the fine grain and subtleties and surprises of the real world. And so that's one way of reading this text. And there's kind of a long-standing issue that I've had in teaching Zhuangzi and in reading people's interpretations of Zhuangzi. I actually don't think that Zhuangzi is such a big proponent of the back to nature view that particular reading that I just gave you presupposes. I think that Zhuangzi kind of recommends acquiring a kind of second nature, an artificial nature that still has many of the same features as natural instinct does. It's not based on verbal formulas or rules or what have you. You can rely a great deal on something that looks like instinct. It's just that they're not entirely native instincts. They're not entirely inborn or innate. They're acquired. So
what you just said raises this question I had with this third approach, this what you called quiet inner integrity, because I was actually thinking that you do find Zhuangzi advocating something like this, like with the like the skill masters, like the butcher, and like these great Taoist sages that seem to have mastered skills. I mean, they're living in a kind of conventional way. I mean, they're making bells, they're butchering, they're making,
they're swimming, they're yeah, right.
Yeah. So like, I thought, isn't that, I was a little bit surprised by this. Like, I thought he's okay with this kind of living in the world, as long as you're kind of detached, you can maintain your integrity, but you can outwardly, raise a family, go to your cubicle and do your stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So our very first episode, which was all about this philosophical double vision that Zhuangzi recommends, it seems like it presupposes maybe a kind of quiet inner integrity, where what we call seeing things from the human point of view involves a certain amount of compliance with the way the world actually is. But insofar as you still hold on to this heavenly point of view, you don't get too emotionally invested in outcomes and in your activities and in your projects. And so that seems like a kind of quiet inner integrity. Yeah. And yet it's still not sufficient, at least according to this dialogue, because as Yan Hui has described what we're calling quiet inner integrity, he still has an agenda, I think, is what he's trying to suggest. I mean, after all, he is going to the Lord of the Wei's court. And even though he's going to be sort of outwardly, and maybe for most intents and purposes, not trying to convert him, still he's holding on to this plan that somehow maybe he can make friends with him and somehow win his trust and then eventually convert him. So that's then what leads Confucius to the final recommendation. And I guess maybe I should read Yan Hui's line. So he says, having just been critiqued by Confucius yet again, says, okay, I have nothing else to offer. May I ask what to do?
And then Confucius says, you must fast. Let me explain. Is it easy to do anything with your mind? If you think it is, bright heaven will not approve.
That translation, is it easy to do anything with your mind? That's one way of translating it. You could just sort of say, if you propose to do something with your mind, where the mind takes charge, remember that expression earlier, making the mind your teacher, where your mind is responsible, your mind is the director, then bright heaven will not approve. So heaven understood as something like maybe cosmic forces of nature, or maybe something more profound, just isn't going to cooperate and approve of behavior that's sort of mind directed. And that's why you need to fast. As you mentioned earlier, Richard, fasting the mind is an important term. The term in Chinese is xing. Some of you who speak modern Chinese may recognize the jai. It's the same jai as chi jai or shou jai. It refers to fasting, even to keeping a vegetarian or kind of Buddhist diet in contemporary Chinese, modern Chinese. So anyway, Yan Hui, having heard this word jai, which means fast, is really surprised. He's like, well, I've fasted. I'm from a poor family. I've often gone without food for long periods of time. And Confucius says, no, that's not what I mean. I mean fasting the mind. And then I guess I should turn it over to you since you're speaking for Confucius. Confucius explains how one fasts the mind.
Yeah, so here is Confucius. He says, unify your zhi, or plans. Do not listen with your ears, but listen with your mind. Do not listen with your mind, but listen with your qi. Listening stops with the ear. The mind stops with signs. Qi is empty and waits on external things. Only the way gathers in emptiness. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind.
Yes. Oh, God, this is really, for me, really evocative. So, yeah, first, one thing about that first part of Confucius's response, there's more to read, but just to stop there for a second, I feel like Confucius is sort of walking through the way you step back from making the mind your teacher. So first he says, do not listen with your ears, but listen with your mind. One way of understanding that is to say, instead of just kind of worrying about whether you're complying with instructions, think with your own mind, right? That's like a step up from just trying to comply with people's instructions. You're actually thinking for yourself. But then he walks that back too. He says, do not listen with your mind, but listen with your qi. All right. There's a lot of discussion in scholarship, secondary literature, and in the commentaries about what he means by listening with your qi. I think the thing we can say relatively safely, I don't know if you agree, Richard, is he just means that you stop kind of planning and worrying. You just and start thinking instinctually, You don't necessarily rely on plans, schemes, rules, or what have you. You just kind of more or less rely on instinct. You react to the situation as you see it. But for what it's worth, if you want to kind of understand what the underlying cosmology, physiology here is when he says, listen with your qi, I like to use an example that I take from Brian Van Norden when I teach. I often use his introduction to classical Chinese philosophy when I teach Chinese philosophy. He says, you could get an intuitive sense of what qi is in the classical Chinese picture just by thinking about the atmosphere, the social atmosphere in a room when you walk in. So if you walk into a room and you can tell that people are having fun, maybe they've just been joking or something, they're laughing, and they're smiling and talking kind of animatedly, and you pick up on that vibe, right? And you start smiling and joking too. That means you've sort of detected the qi in the room, right? There's a kind of camaraderie in the room and picked up on it. That's sort of listening with your qi. If you somehow say something that's really inapt for that situation, like let's say you come in and instead of joking with people, you're really serious, you're sort of a Debbie Downer, or maybe you make a joke that you think is kind of funny, but in fact comes across as really critical of someone, that's changed the qi of the room, right? So it's changed the kind of social atmosphere of the room.
Mm-hmm. The energy, the mood.
Yeah, exactly. The energy or the mood in the room. Yeah, right. Understood as sort of an intersubjective thing. Yeah. Or maybe something even more external.
I noticed that book Ziporyn, instead of qi, he says spirit. Listen with your spirit.
Yeah.
That's the way he puts it.
Yeah. And I'm not sure exactly why he does that, but it seems like it's a good way of kind of demystifying making it more familiar to people, I think you don't necessarily have to subscribe to the existence of this thing qi that Zhuangzi apparently posits or presupposes in order to understand what he means by listening with spirit. I mean, it's something that we understand. So he says, qi is empty and waits on external things. Only the way gathers in emptiness. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind. So that word for emptiness is xu, xu wei to xu in modern Chinese. Empty is a good literal translation, but there are a lot of both classical and post-classical Chinese texts that spend a lot of time, devote a lot of space and energy to unpacking this term xu. It's basically understood in many contexts as a kind of intellectual virtue, an epistemic virtue, I should say, a virtue of the mind that plays a role in helping us attain knowledge, a kind of role for which we can claim some credit. So I think it's useful to think of it in many cases as something like open-mindedness. At the very least, we can say that if you do achieve emptiness of the mind, then it certainly entails that you will be open-minded, which is to say you're open to lots of different views, including ones that you had previously been predisposed to disagree with or find wrong-headed or what have you. Yeah, so the fasting of the mind, it's not much of a description. It's not like he's given you instructions on how to meditate on the breath or what have you, to think of a kind of standard object of meditation. He's not giving you a step-by-step manual, of course. I'm not sure what to make of those people who say that there is a kind of mental discipline being presupposed here when he talks about fasting of the mind. But at the very least, we can say it has certain implications that when you practice fasting the mind, you'll achieve a kind of open-mindedness.
Now, I know that, is it into later parts of Zhuangzi where the mirror metaphor is invoked? So you should be like, and I know later Confucians talk about that. So you should be like a mirror where, I guess, because the mirror basically reflects any object. And once the object is gone, the mirror, of course, is the object is gone from the mirror as well. And yeah, you should be open in that way. Yeah,
exactly. That's a metaphor that's meant to capture metaphorically or by analogy certain dimensions of open-mindedness. Yeah. So if it's a good mirror, it reflects the object that's in front of it exactly as it is. It doesn't hold on to the object. So when the object is no longer in front of it, it no longer reflects it. Whereas most of our minds are bad mirrors. We hold on to objects well past their time. We distort those images. When the ancient writers think of mirrors, they often think of basically placid surfaces of water, because that's oftentimes where people did most of their mirroring, where they looked at the features of their own faces and that sort of thing. And so they say, listen, if it's windy or if you drop a rock in a puddle of water, then of course there are going to be ripples. That's going to distort the image. Yeah. So that emptiness that's supposed to be the achievement of fasting the mind could be described and is described elsewhere in the Zhuangzi as being like making the mind like a mirror. Yeah.
One question though, unifying your plans. That was the beginning of what Confucius says. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So plans is Sure. Yeah. Sure. Understood as sometimes as commitment, or some people even translate it as will, perhaps too strong. Yeah. But this is something that the commentators are really interested in. They think that Zhuangzi is trying to allude to a kind of unity of mind or heart and mind that he thinks is lacking in the three other psychological profiles. So only by adopting this fourth psychological profile, which I'm calling no agenda, will you achieve a kind of unity of commitment or plans. Up until then, you just have kind of a mishmash of plans that maybe work at cross purposes with each other, or at least they don't necessarily work together harmoniously. So that's one way of interpreting it. And no doubt there are other ways too. But I did want to sort of note that's a theme that appears in the commentaries, is that Zhuangzi is, he's encouraging his readers, and through the mouthpiece of Confucius, encouraging Yan Hui to strive for a kind of what I want to call wholeheartedness or psychological unity, such that they're not necessarily a bunch of discombobulated thoughts and plans that don't necessarily work in concert or in harmony with one another.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so Yan Hui, having just heard a little bit about fasting the mind, says now he's starting to sound a little bit wiser for the first time. He says, prior to receiving this instruction, I was full of thoughts of myself. Or he says, actually, he names himself, full of thoughts of Hui. But having applied it, it's as though Hui never existed. Hui is his personal name, right? Chinese names, personal name goes second. So he's talking about himself. It's as though I never existed. Is this what you mean by emptiness?
Confucius responds, perfect, let me tell you. You can go wander in his cage without being moved by his fame. If you're getting through, sing. If not, stop. No schools, no prescriptions. Dwell in unity and lodge in what cannot be helped, and you're almost there.
Yeah. Oh. See, for me, this is where the dialogue gets really interesting. And for me, the interesting parts are always the parts where I'm just not sure. I'm not super confident that I understand what's going on. I have a number of theories. I don't know about you, but it seems like we could go a number of ways with it. At first, it seems to me like Confucius is saying perfect, and then he gives a kind of strategy, but then he concludes the strategy by saying, if you do this, you're almost there. So I'm not quite sure whether he's actually endorsing the strategy or saying that it still falls a little bit short. But the strategy is one that I can really relate to as this peacemaker, as this person who's been a lifelong peacemaker. He says, you go wander in his cage without being moved by his fame. If you're getting through, sing. If not, stop. No schools, no prescriptions. All right. So here's my sort of autobiographical confession. This is something I've done many times. So I've, like most people, get really wrapped up in the social issues of the day. I have my own views. I have some views that I think are just obviously right. And I'm sort of appalled that other people don't see things my way. And I realize, of course, I've realized since my youth, really, that if I go in swinging, well, people are just not going to be persuaded at all. They'll just dig in their heels. So what I tend to do, frankly, is make friends and then hope that opportunities will arise where they'll say, well, what do you think about Donald Trump or, or gun control or what have you? And then when I have them in this sort of in my hands, as it were, like finally now they're curious about me and what I think, this is my chance. And I'm not really pushy, but I do sometimes tell, I do often sort of say what I think and give them the reasons. And I'm always hoping that will somehow convert them. So I'm sort of like, I guess I'm kind of doing what he would recommend that I do if I were in the presence of someone who is really influential, just in virtue of having a lot of status and fame. He says, you go wander in his cage without being moved by his fame. If you're getting through, sing. If not, stop. All right. So that's what I do. I kind of look for opportunities to sing like a caged bird. I can't tell, though, whether Confucius is actually recommending that Yan Hui pursue that strategy or if it still falls a bit short of the ideal. Yeah. And I don't know. There's this kind of final paragraph of material that we could read where Confucius describes oftentimes in the Zhuangzi, when he describes the sort of ideal state of, of agency or of coping with the world or what have you, when he describes the sort of ideal, that he stops using language that's sort of readily intelligible and starts speaking a little more mysteriously. But for me, it's a really powerful, evocative, almost poetic conclusion. So I suppose we should read it. If you don't, since you're playing Confucius, I'll let you read it, Richard.
Okay, so this is the conclusion of this passage with Confucius. To stop leaving tracks is easy. Not to walk upon the ground is hard. It's easy to fake what people do. Faking what heaven does is hard. You've heard of using wings to fly, but not of using no wings to fly. You've heard of using knowledge to know, but not of using no knowledge to know. Look up at the hole in the wall that fills the empty room with light. The blessed stop stopping. Not stopping means galloping while you sit. If you let the ears and the eyes communicate with the inside and banish knowledge outside the mind, then even ghosts and spirits will come to dwell. Why not men? This is the transformation of 10,000 things, the secret of the ancient sages, not to mention ordinary people. That is a tough passage.
It is really tough.
Sure what's going on here.
I always have my approach in class after we read a tough passage is to begin with the stuff where I feel like I can speak with a little more confidence, and then leave the rest open. Yeah. So at the very end of the paragraph, he says, if you let the ears and the eyes communicate with the inside and banish knowledge from the outside the mind, then even the ghosts and spirits will come to dwell. Why not men? It says that is, another way of translating that is, how much more so would this be true for human beings? The point is, if you achieve this kind of ideal state, which I'm still going to call the no agenda state. And you've banished knowledge outside the mind. So you've not come in with any sort of pre-existing, with any epistemic commitments whatsoever. Well, even ghosts and spirits, these sort of powerful supernatural beings, will come to dwell there. So certainly human beings will too. They'll be attracted to this. This will be fertile, comfortable ground for them to rest on. This will be an appealing place for them to be. So you're going to have this sort of charismatic effect on people, I think the text is suggesting. Confucius goes on, this is the transformation of 10,000 things. So he is, at the end of the day, endorsing some kind of conversion picture, right? This is what's really interesting to me, is that Confucius does recommend that Yan Hui attempt, yet to be discerned, use of the word attempt, to convert. It's just that he isn't supposed to sort of go to the state of Wei with any agenda. And so maybe in some sense his intention, I don't know, as an incurrent state or something, as a kind of conscious or even unconscious thing that he's deliberately trying to implement, the intention to convert shouldn't be there. But the end result is still going to be transformation. People are going to be transformed by someone who fasts the mind and adopts this sort of psychological persona.
But why is he going at all? I mean, intention, as I learned from Elizabeth Anscombe, has to do with the answer to the why question. So that's how you find out the intention of the person. You ask, why are you doing something?
I mean, it's super tough. Like, the answer is it's clearly supposed to be, you have reasons to go, and yet you don't, right? In one sense you do, in another sense you don't, And one of the hard things to do in understanding, especially Taoist philosophy, but a lot of classical Chinese philosophy, is to figure out in what sense you do have reasons or aims or purposes, and in what sense you don't, And all I can do is kind of wave my hands at the complexity of this issue. I mean, there are lots of examples from real life that I can think of that sort of mirror this complexity, where you both do and don't have reasons. I mean, there's this F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? The author of
Great Gatsby.
Great Gatsby, yeah. Like, who was always writing about wealthy people. He apparently gave this advice, I think it was to his sister, I'm not sure, in a letter. This might just be urban legend, I don't know. But he was discouraging someone, I think his sister, from just marrying for money, So he said, don't marry for money. It's obviously going to get you in lots of trouble. You're stuck under the same roof with this person you don't really necessarily love. And you've gone, you've married them for all the wrong reasons and so on. So what you do instead, he says, is go where the money is and marry for love. And there's a sense in which, here's the question. So I guess what I'm imagining him doing is like recommending that someone go, I don't know, where all the rich people are, and just sort of hang out where the rich people are. And eventually, of course, if you're going to develop a crush on someone, and then you will fall in love with someone who just so happens to be rich, right? And so the question is, if you adopt that policy and you just go hang out on an island, a kind of resort island where rich people hang out, are you acting on the reason? Are you marrying out of money after all? Is your reason for going there and marrying people and finding a kind of life partner to marry rich? Or is it in fact accurate to say that, because you develop a crush on someone while you're there, not necessarily because they're rich, right? You don't marry for money after all, right? There's a sense in which you are marrying for money, and there's a sense in which you're not. And I feel like that could help us. I'm not sure if that's quite the right analogy, but it kind of helps us see the sense in which Confucius thinks you do go, that Yan Hui, his star student, would be going to the state of Wei to convert the Lord of Wei to a more humane form of governance, and yet in another sense not, right?
So isn't what's going on there that ultimately the justification of him going is conversion? But once he's there, he's supposed to act not from that reason, but just to, for all kinds of other reasons, just hanging out with the Lord and, I don't know, living the life there. So the justification is not supposed to be the motivation of the actions once he's there. Sorry, this comes back to this old paper by Michael Stalker. I don't know if you've read that paper, The Schizophrenia of Modern Ethical Theories.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he criticizes utilitarianism for this, because it says on the one hand, the ultimate justification for doing something is because it maximizes the greatest happiness for all. But when you have, let's say, you're visiting a friend at the hospital, for that justification to be your motive, there's something wrong about that. You don't want to say to your friend, if the friend asks, why are you here? Well, because I want to maximize the greatest happiness for all, buddy. That is not, or your spouse, like, like you do something, you buy a birthday present, or you do something nice for your spouse, and your ultimate justification is why I did it. Or even, I think he criticizes Kantians. I don't know if these are fair criticisms, by the way, but if you say it's out of duty, that's why I visited you, honey, while you're sick, because I need to conform my will to, to the ultimate rational moral principle or something like that. That's not the proper motive.
Yeah, exactly. All right. I worry that we'll go too far into the weeds of philosophical geekery, but yeah, it seems to me that like one way you can account for the situation that I've just described is you could say the justification for your action is to convert someone, this Lord of Wei, to a more humane form of governance. Or in the case of F. Scott Fitzgerald's sister, is to marry for money. That's the justification. The motive is different. The motive is, presumably in the case of the sister, she genuinely falls in love with someone and finds something lovable about the person that she falls in love with, independently of their wealth. Similarly, what motivates Yan Hui once he's there is not necessarily to convert the Lord of Wei to a more humane form of governance, but something else. I don't know, like to help a friend, I don't know, or something. Or
now, one problem with that is once he's there and he forgets about the justification, which is what he seems to have to do because he doesn't want that to be a motive, then he might just end up not converting him, maybe just loving the way of the Lord Wei, and also participating, become kind of corrupt like him. And that sometimes happens. You want to do the good by getting into law or something, and then you're like, oh, I got to pay off my debts, I'm going to go to corporate law, but eventually I'm going to go to nonprofit practice as soon as I pay off. But now you're in it and you're living this luxurious lifestyle, and you're kind of stuck, and now you're just immersed in that kind of life.
Yeah, exactly. That's a sort of standard story I hear. People borrow so much to go to law school, and then so they think, well, I'll take this high paying kind of power firm sort of job first so I can pay off my debts, and then eventually I'll work for a nonprofit. And but then of course,
but you pay it off and you're like, well, I need to save up a little bit. I have some kids now. I mean, I could totally see, I probably would have done that actually. I'm not saying that like people who do that are so bad. I totally understand it.
Yeah.
I could see how it works.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there is this kind of serene confidence in the text and in a lot of early Taoist texts that like when you achieve this emptiness of mind, somehow the force of the good reasons will compel you to do, the thing that's both wise and sagacious and prudent and what have you. But one rightly doubts whether that's the case. Maybe, in fact, Yan Hui goes to the Lord of Wei. The Lord of Wei says, oh, here's this well-educated guy who's a famous student of this famous teacher, Confucius. Let me fet him, let me treat him really nicely and flatter him and so on. And before you know it, Yan Hui has some kind of ministerial position that doesn't require much work, but involves a lot of, high profile, prestigious, rituals and that kind of stuff. And he really likes the job. And
that's the untold story of Yan Hui. It turns out that he becomes a corrupt, like Darth Vader type.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So there are lots of questions. And by the way, I'm still not entirely sure whether the description that we gave of Yan Hui's reasons is right, that his justificatory reasons are to convert the Lord of Wei, but then his motivational reasons are different. You could also cash it out in terms of like higher order motivations or something, or the motivations that regulate other motivations, There's a lot to be said about it, and it's all really interesting. I guess another thing I feel like relatively comfortable saying with confidence is that this is meant to exhibit a point of contrast between Taoist approaches to something that's very important in this particular period of Chinese philosophy, which is winning state approval. So the Zhuangzi comes from a period in Chinese philosophy when there were lots and lots of schools of philosophical thought. You could think of those schools as having kind of proponents that were peddling their own vision for the way. So the way understood something as like a way of life, but also as a way of organizing societies. So kind of a way of governance. So there are lots of other schools. It seems like one way of reading the text is to say, well, for the Taoists, they're sort of recommending that their particular way of winning state approval over another way, which is to say, basically to have no agenda or something really close to no agenda whatsoever. And so it's meant to be contrasted with these other approaches. I mentioned earlier that the non-confrontational integrity was at least reminds me of Analects 1434, of a passage in the Analects of Confucius. So it seems like at the very least, the Confucian view is being targeted. And the Confucian view, again, is that view where you have a kind of non-confrontational integrity, where you stick to your guns, your principles, but you're not abrasive about it. You're not always preaching to others. You just sort of, your good example is supposed to influence people. It clearly suggests that's not going to work. The other obvious point of contrast really is any view, and maybe we could think of the Moists. This is another early school of Chinese thought that was very influential. Any view that says arguments, reasons, justifications are supposed to do the work. That you just, if you disagree with someone's view, you go in and you give them the argument. You tell them why that view is wrong, and you give them a justification for another view. It's clearly meant to suggest that that approach is going to make people dig in their heels as well. And I think that's right. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention that one way of reading this passage that I think is not really controversial. I think most people who are able to sort of put these texts in historical context will agree, is as offering a different model for winning state support that is distinctively Taoist and emphatically not Confucian, not Moist, and probably not recognizable as characteristic of any other of the major schools too.
Yeah, these are all very interesting issues, just about the nature of persuasion, the nature of how you can convert anyone or change someone's mind. And I mean, it is kind of interesting because, yeah, like this is about state persuasion or persuading a ruler. So that's a specific kind of thing that we're discussing there. So maybe to be fair to Zhuangzi, he might not be saying, oh, like this is the way to persuade all people for everything.
Yes.
Yeah, we are talking about a specific form of persuasion or a certain, particular goal here. Because, in some ways, I mean, of course, like Confucians were somewhat right too, because like, nonviolent protests or figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, they they were kind of going with, the second model.
Yeah, the quiet inner integrity or the non-confrontational.
The non-confrontational, because I mean, they stuck to their guns and they were, protesting in a nonviolent way, but they definitely had a goal and an agenda and an end, and they were able to persuade a lot of people. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, I was raised on Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, so I can't help but really admire. I'm sometimes moved to tears by people who, take great risks to speak truth to power, but then recognizing that they're never going to persuade someone through anger alone, sacrifice their own kind of health and well-being in a way,
like hunger strikes.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. So I'm sort of torn, but as I sort of admitted to you earlier, because I'm temperamentally inclined to distrust that part of me, that angry part of me, which wants to persuade people kind of through sheer force of will, to just bombard them with arguments or present them with a really powerful, compelling story, anecdote, or example that I think is going to persuade them, or just shame people, make them feel bad for being an awful person and supporting Trump or whatever it is, That's part of I've really learned from a very early age not to listen to. And I feel like it's a good instinct not to listen to that part of yourself, that in fact, you're much more likely to be successful at persuading people if you go about it in this less abrasive way. But I also have to say, like, it seems to me that Zhuangzi, the author of this text here, is trying to always be mindful, is reminding us basically that human beings are this ego-driven intersubjective beings. So much of their mental, psychological resources are almost automatically devoted to sort of discerning what other people really think about you, And we're so good at it that it's kind of a fool's errand to think that you can go convert someone as a sort of hidden agenda. No matter how many layers of sort of respect and niceness and friendliness you try to hide your agenda behind, they'll be pretty good at detecting that agenda, I think that's one of the upshots of the dialogue, is that basically you have to get to the point where you don't even have that agenda at all,
That's right. Yeah. No, I remember when I was younger, there would be these like shelters or food shelters that I would visit. And sometimes the ones that were, and not all of them were like this. A lot of them were through these Korean Christian missionaries. And they, one thing that I remember they would do, and I did not like it, was you would have to, in order to get the lunch, listen to like some Bible passages. And that was like a prerequisite. And I mean, I kind of understand, like, I mean, I'm sure they were well-intentioned and they wanted to convert the people, but like, it just already smacked of an agenda And I think
Yeah.
they were actually better served if they just didn't do that and they just try to create friendships and give, share the food. And then, of course, if they wanted to talk about that, anyone can, and then they could. I think that's just such a
Yeah.
more effective, but also just, I don't know, I guess, yeah, it seems like a better model anyways, but certainly also more effective too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reminded, I think I talked to you about this earlier, Daryl Davis. Have you ever heard of him before I mentioned his name? I think he's gotten kind of some fame for his work.
You sent a link. We should put it in the show notes to this article, this description of him by Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist. And I realized once I had read it that I had read it before. Maybe I'll let you describe him if you want. He's really remarkable. Yeah. And that part of me that was raised on Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi also really admires him. So it's Daryl Davis, Daryl is how he spells his first name, and then the usual Davis, Davis. So he's a Black musician who's befriended many, many members of racist extremist groups like the KKK. And by his account, he's persuaded over 200 of these people to leave these extremist groups. And he has some evidence to show for it, because one of the things he does is when people leave the KKK, they give up their robes to him. So he has a big collection of robes, So it's really remarkable, in part because it's hard to imagine even being him and doing this, like making friends with people who are just so overtly racist and hostile that they would join a group like the KKK. He has a podcast series, apparently. He's written books. He's given talks on persuasion. His method, according to Kristof anyway, is basically to start in listening mode. So he befriends people and he just listens to them. He doesn't necessarily come in swinging, trying to shame people into recognizing their prejudices and giving up their membership in the KKK or whatever. Anyway, it seems to me like I haven't had time to really think about how it maps onto our 4 psychological profiles, but it certainly seems more Taoist in spirit. I mean, it is really remarkable. So like the one thing he's very clear about is that he doesn't come out swinging. He doesn't befriend these people who are white supremacists and then immediately start talking about what's wrong with white supremacy. And he seems to rely a lot on trust and friendship to do the work of persuading them and converting them, which is indeed a very indirect way of persuading and converting people. So it's, in that respect, it does seem very Taoist.
Now, I think for him to be able to do that, though, he must have some deep belief that even the grand wizards or the KKK members that he ended up becoming friends with were like worthy of like friendship, and that there was something good and decent and dignified about them, even while they're KKK members, because I think he has to somehow want to develop a friendship with them. Like, I mean, course, I think he wanted to change their minds. I mean, of course. And I think that's totally reasonable, obviously. But he must have saw that, no, actually, these people, they have erroneous, terrible beliefs, but they're valuable. They're worth befriending.
Yeah.
They have independent worth. That is a tough way to think about people that you just utterly, could maybe find repulsive or, Right. So that's, I think, very remarkable. It shows like a deep kind of love of humanity. I mean, that's a very remarkable and a very, not a normal kind of, I mean, that's not how I think most people think of these people who are totally on the political opposite end or have totally different values from them.
Yeah, right. Sorry to switch over to Martin Luther King Jr., but he has this concept of agapic love, or agape, Agape, biblical Greek term, refers to a certain kind of love that's an unconditional love, as I understand it, for human beings as such. And in one of his essays, Martin Luther King Jr. famously says, you don't have to actually like the people that you love in this agapic sense, but you do have to love them. And it has something to do with sort of the recognition of the basic humanity of another person and their sort of very special value as a human being. Yeah. So one imagines that Daryl Davis really sort of embraces that kind of love, and so that he's able to see the humanity and the sort of the potential friend and the human potential in these people that he befriends. And that seems really remarkable. I do sometimes wonder whether we're supposed to see something similar going on in the Zhuangzi. Actually, David Wang does say, David Wang is a scholar of Chinese philosophy. He's really interested in Zhuangzi and has really great stuff on Zhuangzi and relativism. He does say in his kind of early book on moral relativism, that in the Zhuangzi, you see this notion of ci, compassion, as playing a really key role, that there's some kind of deep commitment to the recognition of other people and the value of those people and their points of view. Maybe there's something like agape working there, although you don't see a lot of evidence in this passage. You do see a kind of what I would consider to be an almost religious hope, or at least some kind of spiritual commitment, or what we might call, I don't know, rational hope, maybe, if you don't like it, the kind of religious characterization of it, that a certain kind of open-mindedness that you achieve through fasting the mind will be contagious, so that other people will also somehow emulate your example and will become persuadable. So there's some kind of hope that, like, I don't know, people can be persuaded by the power of good reasons, independently of their own subjective preferences or whims, And so there is a kind of, to me, a really remarkable sense of faith or hope in that respect. Just not sure if there's something like agape, so maybe that's, I'm not sure, but I'm tempted to say that's maybe one difference between the Taoist model and the Daryl Davis model. The Daryl Davis model, it does seem like he really does love, in this very special sense, all these people, including the ones who belong to groups that are deeply committed to hating him and establishing a systematic dominance over him. Yeah, I don't know if you see the same thing in Zhuangzi or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, the compassion, that David Wong talks about in the Zhuangzi. Yeah, I know PJ Ivanhoe, I think he thinks that's a bit exaggerated or embellished. We don't really find that as much in the Zhuangzi, or at least he thinks. So I guess there is some, scholarly debate there.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We're talking about the secondary literature on Zhuangzi. Yeah. So PJ Ivanhoe criticizes David Wong for that view. He thinks that the word compassion, it does appear in the Zhuangzi, but it's not in the so-called core chapters. So it's not really part of the core vision of Zhuangzi. Yeah. It seems like in Zhuangzi, the open-mindedness you're supposed to achieve is in many ways a product of really skillful philosophical skepticism and the kind of mastery of what we were calling in that a couple episodes ago, the heavenly point of view, this more panoramic point of view where you're able to put your own pretense of knowing things in context and recognize that as a human being, deeply flawed. And also the kind of this recognizing that your own projects are small and minor and don't matter much in the end. So this kind of like ability to put things in perspective seems to be doing a lot of the work of getting you to that point where you're not, trying to, in great earnest, to convert people to your cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And there's also this other issue that we might have discussed in the notes when we were preparing for this episode about the power of like arguments or reasons or philosophy, which is something that I've thought for a long time about. Can arguments really persuade? And some are much more skeptical, like, the great philosopher Bernard Williams thought that actually arguments don't really have the kind of power that philosophers want to give them. And a lot of it is based on maybe just emotions or already like certain inclinations that have been shaped for a long time in people and certain psychological profiles and so on. Yeah, I remember. Do you remember this line? It's from the philosopher, Robert Nozick. So I believe he said that he always wanted to have an argument so powerful that if someone were to deny the conclusion, they would just die. So that was like the ultimate aspiration. Have you heard of that? Yeah, I think that was Robert Nozick. Maybe I'm getting the reference.
No, wrong. I haven't heard of it, but it does describe this kind of this deep yearning that I think we do sometimes have.
Sometimes philosophers want, come on, like, how could you deny this?
Because we don't have enough objective markers of success. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, all you have is this kind of subjective impression that, it was a good argument. And maybe some other people agree with you. But of course, it feels like it's just a subjective impression on their part too. So now it's not like you've now got a machine up and running,
Yeah, that's right. So you can't really verify. But I mean, the thing about arguments though is what I've come to think is, it's not so much that like you present a good argument and the person who disagrees with you automatically changes their mind. But even in my own self, what I realize is exposure over time, gradually it can kind of maybe not necessarily even totally change your mind, but it can kind of help you revise your beliefs. Yeah. Maybe the strength or the confidence you have in a belief changes or shifts. Actually does happen over a period of time. I think may not look like it has any power, but I think we are influenced, by these various arguments that we hear, and not always, in exactly the way that people might think. But so I think there is room for arguments. I mean, what do you think, Justin?
Yeah, it's so complicated. And I worry about these things all the time, frankly. I mean, it seems to me that everyone has a kind of, like people tell these conversion stories about themselves. I mean, whether it's how they came to really embrace a religion, sometimes it's re-embracing a religion that they grew up with, greater fervor or something. But sometimes it's just like how they converted to a different point of view about something really fundamental. And they always have to tell the story such that they ended up adopting the view that they now really embrace for their own reasons. So it's never like, oh, I felt, people shamed me, or like I had this friend who just made me feel like a rotten person, or I took this class where we were led to feel ashamed of our views. No one ever wants to admit to being coerced, whether like socially or actually, physically coerced. There's some role at the very least in getting you to stand behind your views and having good reasons. So like, what I'm saying is like, at least when you give someone reasons for a position, you might say you're giving their future self a way of justifying position that they might hopefully adopt that they can really stand behind. And, I think this actually does relate to the theme of wholeheartedness that we're talking about earlier. Wholeheartedness, I should pronounce that more clearly. There's a way in which you kind of can live more wholeheartedly if you do have reasons for your views, I'm not sure if Zhuangzi would agree, actually. I think maybe this is some of my later Confucian philosophers would be quick jump on board with this view. So I think maybe it's kind of too weak for your purposes. I don't know, Richard, but I take some solace in that thought that even if the reasons aren't actually doing the converting at the moment of conversion, maybe the moment of conversion happens through friendship and trust. And I don't know, maybe reading a compelling book on your own for your own reasons or what have you. Still, the justifications help you to stand behind and kind of firm up the position in the longer run, And that means that you're a much more comfortable way of life that you adopt later once you have those reasons and justifications. That's something, I think,
Yeah. I mean, I think we are the sort of creatures who reflect and want to think about why we believe what we believe. And I think philosophers think that's a good thing, right? And I think sometimes people like Jonathan Haidt, who I've learned much from, I enjoyed reading his works, like The Righteous Mind, his great book. I think he did some good work in helping us to show how emotions play also a very important role in the way that we get persuaded and the way that we decide. But I think sometimes they also go a little bit overboard, as if like we just kind of are completely dragged by our emotions and like our intelligence and thoughts don't play any role. I don't think that's true. I think we are psychologically very complicated, and emotions obviously play a very strong role, but we do have minds and we do have thoughts, and we can ask about why we believe what we believe, whether it coheres, whether it harmonizes with other beliefs. I mean, yeah, so I think it's a very rich and complicated process, and philosophy and reasoning doesn't maybe have as much of a role as some maybe analytic philosophers think, but I think it's part of the picture for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think actually we could talk for an hour or something about all the subtle ways in which reasons might nevertheless, even though they don't have a lot of persuasive power sort of directly, they can sort of slip in through the back door, or the cumulative effect of reasons can over time persuade someone. Or I'm tempted to say there's a way of, sorry to kind of digress here and talk about Jonathan Haidt, but yeah, he's a really interesting thinker on this point. He's a social psychologist essentially, but he does sort of venture into philosophy now and then. There's a way of reading him that he would disagree with, but I think it's actually defensible, according to which reasons do persuade people socially. So it's like, by getting taken up by social groups that reasons come to persuade people. So of course, reasons aren't going to persuade a person in total isolation, but you can get a social group on board with reasons. You have to sort of set some of Jonathan Haidt's views to the side, but to make that work. But there's evidence for it in the research that he cites. Mm-hmm. So I feel like this has been quite a wide range. Yeah, quite a journey. Yeah. I really this is why we decided to do this podcast, Richard, because we both like to digress and link the classical Chinese passages up with other philosophy that we're reading or contemporary issues. And so it feels to me like a pretty natural sort of discussion. And
yeah, it was. Yeah. And I hope listeners enjoyed it. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But at least I enjoyed this conversation. Yeah. So therefore it was worth it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Richard. I certainly did too. Yes. And we can hope. That's all I'll say, is that I have that reasonable hope that others will enjoy it too. We should kind of move to the conclusion then. And this is normally where we would tell you what the next episode, which is episode 5, will be about. And unfortunately, though, the answer is we haven't decided yet. We still have some work to do just to kind of edit these recordings and, set them to music and that kind of thing. So that's a few too many steps down the road for us to be sure, but we have many plans. We have lots of interesting people we want to interview and lots of issues we want to discuss. So please do stay tuned. We promise we'll make a wholehearted effort to make it good, whatever it is.
Yeah. And actually feedback would be great too. And we're going to put on our Taoist hats and not be offended by even some, critical comments about how to improve things or, try to be nice. Yeah, actually, It's good to get feedback. Yeah, usually, when you get a paper rejected, right? It is kind of devastating. At least for me, it is. And it's very painful. But so you got to kind of go away from it for a few days. But you do come back. And I do have to say, sometimes, I learn quite a bit from those, even the critical comments, although I wish if they were nicer. That's how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. I will fast the mind before I read your criticisms or your comments and whatever that
also
is.
if you liked it, right? If there's any good things, that's always nice too, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. What are we doing well? Yeah, that's what I try to do as a teacher. I think it's good practice. Yeah, so that's right. We do have plans to open up these episodes for discussion. And so there will be a way that we'll put in the show notes to do that. And we'll make a link. So I suppose that was the way for today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, everyone.